So a hearty welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to welcome you here for the IMWK Research Talk of the Institute for Media, Wisdom and Knowledge, IMWK at the University of Augsburg. And we are here at a special place. We are here at the Medienlabor of the University of Augsburg. So first of all, a huge thank you to Mr. Bieler and all of his team to make this happen. And the topic of this research talk is Media and Democracy in Europe, a discussion of current challenges and threats. And as you know, alone since the 1st of January, so much happened in this regard. There are countless, numerous events happening since then. Yeah? For example, the change of the moderation rules of the big platforms of Facebook and Instagram and so on. So that's why we are very happy to have the honor of 3 guests to discussing it. And let me introduce to you our guests. First of all is Grüne, University of Erfurt. She works there as a senior lecturer and coordinator of the bachelor and master program there. And she recently, well, not that recently, 2 years ago, she published a book with Kai Hafes on global communication. And we are happy to have her here. And then next to her, there's sitting Nico Carpentier. He's professor for media and communication at the university in Prague, the Charles University. He just published a book on media and democracy.
In Europe.
And we're very happy to have him here. And last but not least, Tanja Thomas, professor on media with a special notion on transformation of media culture. And she published a lot, for example, on post-migrant societies, about activism and participation in democracy, and she works also on anti-Semitism and communication. And I am Jeffrey Wimmer, professor for media and communication with a special emphasis on media reality here at the University of Augsburg. We start first with some inputs of our guests and myself, around some minutes. Then we start a discussion, and then we open the discussion to all of you. And we are very eager on your discussion. And I think we have quite an interdisciplinary audience, so that I think fits very well to the topic, media and democracy, which itself is a very complex, contingent thing. And first of all, Nico will start with some input.
Well, thank you for a lovely introduction and for getting all our names and affiliations right, which is always quite an effort. The one thing you forgot is that you also published a book which accidentally is called Democracy and Media in Europe, because you're actually the co-author of that.
That's why I said media and democracy. That's exactly my part. Yeah.
But so this book is sort of a starting point for this conversation, but only a starting point. Yeah. And I think we also discussed this talk beforehand and made sure that we wouldn't be reviewing a book which is boring for all of us. We would like to use that book to think about democracy and media, not about the book. Right? It's a tool. The other little detail, obviously, it's in English, and I am sort of speaking English as well, so I'm probably the only non-German speaker here that's sort of forcing everybody to speak English, for which I'm very grateful. I do understand German, so if you want to say something to me that I'm not supposed to hear, then don't use German. I will understand you. What I want to do as sort of an opening statement is talk a bit about the basic ideas behind the book. I don't want to zoom in on the book. I want to sort of talk a bit about what is in that book as core ideas. And for those who actually managed to look at it, there are actually pictures in it. And I want to show some of these pictures because I think they're helpful. Now, you can't read them, don't even try, you're not supposed to. I will help you in these difficult times of visual impairment. The core idea of the book is that when we both talk about democracy, and we talk about the media's role in democracy, both of these areas, then there are some very core defining elements. What is democracy? And they're quite fixed. For instance, in the case of democracy, the idea that there is a balance between representation and participation. Right? Representation being the delegation of power to a particular political leadership, and participation, the exercise of power through the political community. And that's pretty much what we always understand when we talk about democracy. But then there's so many other elements that are within democracy, and when we talk about media, that are actually object of political struggle. A lot of these areas are not set. And to use my example from before, when we talk about the definition of democracy, participation, and representation, how we balance these two is not given. There's no consensus about that. We all fundamentally disagree, and it's actually part of an ongoing political struggle to move into more participation, those who are defending participatory democracy, and those who actually prefer, say, more a top-down model where the citizenry mostly votes. And that's a political struggle. And if you look at the role of media, you'll find an equal number of political struggles. What do we do with free speech? How much free speech? What are the limits? Do we go into the absolutist version, which is what we have seen in the US and which is being confirmed over and over again? You need to be able to, the famous example, you need to be able to shout fire in a theater because that's free speech. It's not very nice to do, don't try it at home and in the theater, but it's part of this absolutist version of free speech, which is very US based. And then you have the idea of, no, we need to actually relate freedom and free speech with other values. And there are limits to what can be said because it, for instance, affects the dignity of particular groups in society. And that's a political struggle. It's not given, it moves. Now, the movement, and that's where it gets really interesting, so this is the more details, there is also a series of forces that try to push democracy outside democracy. And we call them threats. We don't call them political struggles, even if they are also obviously political struggles, but we call them threats to democracy. Because that's where actually we end up with potentially a new reality, which is no longer democratic. That's where the real threat to democracy starts. And I think we are witnessing some processes that actually are good reasons for concern. They're quite, when it comes to media, for instance, huge issues about sustainability. Right? Who will afford public service, for instance? Who will pay for public service? There's decreasing interest. Colonization, where we see the commercial world actually get a huge grip on platforms, but also on, say, more legacy media. And we see there that the colonization also brings in the role of the owners, media owners, and there's a famous US example which I will not refer to, but hey, you know. But there's also disenchantment, which is a huge threat. If the citizenry disconnects, if there is no interest in democracy with its citizens, if they are not willing to defend democracy, we will not have democracy. So disenchantment, frustration is a major threat to democracy. There's only 5 in our book, and there's an endless list of extensions there. The change of political knowledge, what we call truth, what we actually allow to circulate. Conspiracy theories, forgive me for saying, stupid things, because that's a little footnote. We often see stupidities circulate, and we hardly ever say that they're stupidities. for the record. That's a little footnote which is incredibly interesting and important. And the last threat is violence. Violence is a huge threat to democracy itself, because violence is the moment where democracy stops. Violence is the suspension of democracy. It's the end of democracy. In a media context, we do have symbolic violence. We have the evilness of harassment, of online hatred, and at some point that pushes us outside democracy, because it creates forms of antagonism where we start seeing each other as enemies. And defining the other as enemy is a huge danger to democracy. I don't mind agonism. I don't mind being opposed to each other. But I do have, from a democratic theoretical perspective, huge problems with defining the other as enemy that needs to be destroyed. And that is the fifth threat to democracy. Now, the last thing I want to show you is when we talk about, hey, there are political struggles within democracy, about democracy, and there are threats. Where do you draw the line, right? That's one of the biggest questions, because if there is a political struggle in democracy that is legitimate, democratically legitimate, it's fine, it's good even. We should celebrate that, because that is democracy. But at what point do we shift into the threat? At what point is too much? Where is the threat starting and where is the political struggle in our definition ending? And that is what we're actually struggling with nowadays. When do we have to say this is simply not acceptable from a democratic perspective? And that is I think, one of the biggest questions that we raise. We can't answer it because there's quite a lot of work to be done on that relationship, but that might be part of the discussion. Then, easier said than done, right? It's like what to do. What are the strategies? What to do with this? It's great to do an analysis. We love writing books. Great. What to do with them? And again, there are two areas that I want to flesh out, and then I'll shut up and leave the floor to the others. We often think, when it comes to strategies, we think about the state, what the regulatory system should do, what government should do. They should protect us. True, I agree to some extent. I agree because there are relevant regulatory initiatives. We can strengthen public service, we can strengthen community media, by the way, which we tend to forget. We can have all sorts of limitations on media concentration. We can prevent circulation of some harmful ideas, limiting online hatred, for instance. We can do that. That's a regulatory framework that is more or less possible. The problem is that we've been staring at the state as the ultimate solution. And I think that is where the problem begins. There is a collective responsibility. There is the citizens themselves that need to become activated in protecting democracy. Otherwise, there is no use of having democracy. Without the citizenry, without the political community, there is no democracy. And there are also areas, simply forgive me for the French, it's a Foucault statement, the mettre en discours, to make it public, to discuss about democracy itself, is something we haven't been doing sufficiently. We haven't been developing democratic approaches to contemporary problems. We haven't managed, we were talking about that yesterday, we haven't managed to have a discourse of care, a discourse of belonging, a discourse of cohesion circulate sufficiently. We don't have answers to a number of discourses that are actually posing threats to democracy. We don't have the democratic discourses that can counter that. That's one area where there is a collective cultural responsibility. I think the other area which gets really fascinating is the creation of participatory ethics. We all go online, we all do stupid things. Maybe when we do so, we should think again. Maybe when others do so, we should tell them. And for that, we need a much stronger ethics of not just online participation, but an ethics of participation. To speak also means to have a responsibility for what you say. And that's an ethical process that we need to strengthen. And finally, maybe, and that comes back to this item on stupidity, maybe we should defend truth much more explicitly. We have a role there. And that's also in academia, where we stand up, and once in a while we have to say, this is nonsense. This just doesn't make sense. It's not consistent with any knowledge, and it shouldn't be considered to be knowledge. It's a position, it's a statement, it's not knowledge. We have a role there to protect knowledge through the logics of truth, however complicated that is. And to end up with the Mettre en Discours, just one example, this is a film poster. The film is now being made, and it's called Constructions of Democracy. And it's maybe our little contribution to discussing Mettre en Discours, what is democracy and how does it work? Because we haven't been communicating enough. This film is actually being produced together with an Indonesian community in Prague. So it's quite a multicultural setup, and it will be in the cinemas near you soon. Online, that means, at some point. And you're welcome to watch, but this is not necessarily, well, there is a narcissistic element in what I say, but it's also an invitation to start speaking, all of us. And I think that when it comes to the threats and challenges towards democracy, we have a responsibility to speak and to defend and to protect. That's the introduction. Thank you. Chair?
Perfectly in time. Thank you very much, Nico. We will put the questions afterwards. So the next input will be by Tanja.
Yes, thanks first of all for the invitation and for having me here today. And also Nico said we shouldn't dive into the book too much in detail. I mean, the invitation made me reading it very closely, and it was very nice to have it in my hands because I was just about preparing a panel discussion with journalists. We do have a new established research center on the far right in Tübingen, and we started last term to have a lecture series, and I proposed to have some journalists and a professor of journalism studies for one of the panel discussions. And while reading your book, it was really helpful and gave me a lot of food for thought with regards to my questions. Because you can see, I thought I will start, and I did, start with some references of what's going on right now. I mean, we see Elon Musk giving initiating a dialogue with Alice Weidel on X. He is in one of the biggest newspapers, Welt am Sonntag, to give advice to the voters. He is giving the Hitler salute. And then it was an interesting starting point for the discussion, and Nico mentioned it, on the threats to democracy, the colonization of the public sphere, the transforming of the political knowledge, the symbolic violence and polarization. Because one of the journalists, for instance, she is writing for Der Spiegel, and by the way, she receives attacks on an everyday basis as a journalist. And she told me, well, they had a lot of discussion about how to report on the Hitler salute by Musk. Should they do it or not? Because she told me, and she recommended a newspaper article in the Zeit with the title, "A Hitler salute is a Hitler salute is a Hitler salute." You can read Gertrude Stein there if you like. You don't have to, but it's a well-written article because it says, well, we do have to report because it's really a caesura that somebody, a tech millionaire who is in some kind of responsibilities in the government in the US and at the same time has so much power on digital media, is showing the Hitler salute. We have to report on that. And on the other way, it plays into the attention economy he is trying to use. and he uses it successfully. And on the other hand, we have to show that there is something changing in the discourse. There is a change in what is sayable. And at the same time, if we report on this again and again, we normalize this kind of shift in the discourse. So she showed really the dilemma of reporting on such an issue. And that was only one of the many examples we referred to during this evening. I mean, she told me not only about the attacks on journalism with regards to physical violence when they go outside. And the Spiegel, they have security people. They can afford to have people who are responsible for that. If you go on a local level, on the podium discussion, I had somebody from the local level, and she told me, we don't have the money to have security if we go on the streets. And she also told me they had one article in 2018 reporting on chats on Facebook by staff member of AfD representatives in the parliament in Baden-Württemberg, and they are on court for the 4th time now. They have been there for this single article 3 times, and the court says, you are fine, there's nothing wrong with this article, and they have to go again because the lawyer of the former member of the parliament and who really, I mean, you can go online and read it again. It's really not acceptable at all. I don't want to repeat anything I read there. But it's a lot of costs, resources, energy they have to put into this case they have to deal with. And that's something that's really destroying journalism on a local level. So this is about democracy and media and democracy too. So we have this on a very macro level. We have this on the who is the owner of the platforms and the media, who is in power to perform power. And it made me thinking about the 4th power. And former times we talked about the press and broadcasting station to be the 4th power. And I always had some difficulties with the metaphor because it links it to the separation of power in the state, and the press and broadcasting station, public broadcasting station shouldn't be to do something with the state. So the metaphor is a little bit out of reason. But now we have in the public discourse a debate on the 5th power, which is supposed to refer to the platforms and to the tech millionaires and the algorithm. And the 4th power was assigned to control the state and the representatives. The 5th power now is a threat to the state and its representatives. And there's a big shift we have to think about when we look at media and democracy. And I was wondering, how can we, as you already said, how can we create new spaces for debate and discourses and so on, which are not too much regulated. I mean, there are a lot of ideas how to regulate, not only on a political level, on a transnational level, but also on a very practical level. I talked to people who are doing research on the regulation of platforms, and they suggested to have certificates for accounts that promise to organize democratic discourse, and then to force on a political level the platforms to give them privileged appearance with this certificate accounts. That would be an idea, but sometimes I think is it only a very helpless academic idea? Are we really able to change something with certificates for accounts? But nevertheless, we should think about such ideas. I think we are responsible to do so. Yeah, and with regards to the book, I was wondering if we need new terms. I mean, you talk about publics, and I think the public sphere is also of big importance. When I think about media and democracy, I always think about the public sphere, because the public sphere is the sphere where we dispute about what's legitimate and what's not. And it's the area where people are invited to think about the self-understanding of democracy and about the ways of togetherness, cohabitation, living together. You can call it conviviality or what you like to, and we can discuss about debates, but the terms. But I think, yeah, we have to think about the public sphere more precisely, and that the far right, for instance, is adapting the ideas of the public sphere. They are colonizing the public sphere, as you said. And I read a paper just recently because I was invited to write on counterpublics, and we are very much used to think of counterpublics as emancipatory. But now we have counterpublics who are authoritarian, regressive, neo-reactionary, something like that. And maybe we should go to the public discourse and call it, maybe there is a suggestion to call it defensive public, which is not convincing intuitively, I think. But these colleagues argue that defensive publics are the authoritarian publics who want to go back to white supremacy, patriarchy, and they want to defend this kind of power regimes. And they invite us not to think only about the communicative strategies, but also about power relations. So, yeah, I have tons of ideas with me and questions to you, but I will stop here maybe right now, and I guess I pass the word over to Anne.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. Also from my side, I was asked to consider the global dimension of the topic. So the question of how this debate about democracy and media relates to how we handle globalization, I would say. And I would like to take the next minutes to argue that there is a very strong relationship between the current threats we face in especially European democracies and maybe the problems we face in welcoming global communication and a more global understanding of the world. So maybe to start with, I totally agree when reading the book with this very core idea that democracy is not stable. So of course, it has to be relearned, not only in the field of the systems, but also in the field of life words, everyday life words. That's something I'm interested in. So therefore, the question is, how can we achieve a kind of resilient, democratic, cultural underpinning in societies? How can we achieve this kind of, handling difference, handling plurality also on an everyday level, and to stick to human rights in our everyday life, which I see as a very core idea of democratic togetherness. And so this is the one, and I also agree with what you already referred to, which is this, or if we are to consider some of the very important threats, it's this colonization of the public sphere with racist narratives, with anti-democratic in this sense, narratives, with fear narratives constructed by especially right-wing actors. So the question is, how does that relate to globalization? And I think it relates to globalization insofar as the very substance of these anti-democratic tendencies has to do with, Nico, what you mentioned, the creation, the creation of this fear narrative of the global other, the enemy, and you already mentioned it. So if we construct an idea of the other as an enemy, then we leave the ground of democratic coherence. So therefore, but how is that related to globalization now? In our book, you mentioned it, we discussed a lot this observation that although with the beginning of maybe the 2000s, we've seen a boom in globalization discourse in our society, so we have welcomed globalization, everything is connected, etc. However, as we now recognize, this was never really true. So global communication was not a reality as maybe some of the euphorics have thought about in the beginning. And today we see that we probably, and I'm talking here about the European standpoint, have not culturally digested globalization so far. And if we consider especially right-wing actors to construct these racist images. So my question is, okay, does that have something to do with our insecurity to also relate to global others? So the way we communicate with global others is probably very much linked to the way we communicate with our local others. And here we, an analysis of media comes into play. Of course, the media is a very important actor when it comes to circulate global knowledge and images. And what we have seen in recent years, over the recent years in academia, is that media did not always play a perfect role when transferring the word to us, and so we see a lot of stereotypical coverage still. We see a lot of selective, a lot of stereotypical news about the world, a huge gap of global life words, for example. So I can make a whole list of these, let's say, failures in transporting a kind of global outlook in the media. And I think in these days we see that this failure probably to not being interested in the word so much, to not also not having learned to really listen to what's going on and to listen to others, to maybe relate to global others elsewhere in an emphatic way, I would say, that this is also linked to this idea of the colonization of right-wing discourses. They are racist. They are anti-Islamic, for example, in the German case. And so I sometimes wonder, how can we be resilient if we do not really know about these others, if we do not really have a good global knowledge about all these things? So what's the substance we have in order to counter these right-wing narratives? We might have values, but we probably also lack a lot of knowledge and a lot of relationships with these various life words. So I think, Nico, you mentioned the participatory ethics, and maybe it is my starting point to also ask whether we should reconsider a cosmopolitan ethics, which is very much part of, to my view, very much part of this idea of democracy. So how can I be or how can I perform, so to say, democratic values within a nation if I do not perform then very well beyond the nation. So that's a kind of, so if I do not integrate globally, how can I integrate locally? So this is a kind of connection I'm very much interested in, and where I do see a kind of relationship between, let's say, our global communication and the local threats we face these days, linked to what you have said, but as a little impulse from this global dimension.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I stop here for the moment.
Thank you very much. So I will add some or two perspectives in the next 5 minutes or so, and then we open the discussion. I will start with a quote, and this quote will be 29 years next February, 8th of February. John Barry Barlow, one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, said in his declaration on the independence of the cyberspace he did at Davos, you know this place, just last week, there happened the big conference, and he said, "Governments of the industrial world, you old giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind, on behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You're not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather." It's almost 30 years when the internet was hope, when it was a vision for democracy, for participation, interaction. And it's something also draws on what Tanja said, how successful the foes or the opponents of democracy were in recuperating the notions and instrumentalizing or even perverting notions and processes of and also of technologies, and successful in using it. Almost 30 years later, and you probably know it, what Musk was saying, you are the media now. X empowers the voice of many, and you can become a citizen journalist by posting on X. It's important for the future. And one was striking very much for me 2 days ago when the leader of the AfDs in the Bundestag was saying exactly the same. We are the people. You are from the past, the parties, and you won't have any power to join us. We are the future. And then you see what happened in 30 years. And why is that? That's not only technology change, it's not only political change, it's also change of how do we perceive it. It's a media and cultural change. And that's even more than only amplification of the discourse, what is being said, it's how we perceive it. And that's also interesting from a media and communication point of view. What means the notion to us and how we perceive it. And it's also a tweet I show in the bachelor courses, master courses, and some of you know the famous tweet 2017, there was a tweet, so, in the beginning of 2000, the internet was an escape from the real world, and now it's totally opposite. The real world, like here, is the escape from the internet. And that's something also, why is that? It's something also, it's not only the strength only of the right wing and extremists. It's not only the strength of them and their collaboration. They prepared a lot. Just compare how Trump started his government last week and how did he started 8 years ago. It's also, I would say, the weakness of the others. Probably we didn't care that much in the 30 years. And we, also from the point of regulation, we only looked probably on the economic point of view. In Germany, the federal media authorities, think about them. So like the BLM in Germany and Bavaria is focusing on now in the last 2 or 3 years about podcasting, about the influencers, but only on the economic point of view. Now only research is starting and the discussion is starting. Do they have any responsibilities? What is about the ethics of influencers and them? So how do they have a public responsibility? How professional they are, and so on and so on. And this is one thing also what surprised me a lot, because when I started, and Tanja referred to that, when I started my research on counterpublics, I was very impressed by the globalization critics movement. Think about Occupy and something like that. So they started to revitalize democracy, not to destroy it. And that changed a lot. And I think this, I was also influenced heavily by Henry Jenkins in this idea of participatory culture, which is also an extension of participation, to take part, to be active. Not only to be active in the sense of activism, but on to participate. And this is something striking me. It's another citation. It's, I think, 2 days old, by Carolina Levitt, the speaker of Trump. And she said, "We encourage anyone in this country, whether you are a TikTok content creator, a blogger, a podcaster, if you're producing legitimate news content, no matter the medium, you will be allowed to apply for press credentials to this White House." And the first 2 questions at the press conference went out to Breitbart, which is heavily right-wing, and the other one to Axios. And the others, what we would consider legitimate, they had to fight for the audience. And it's also, I think, we should also discuss about the power of the audience. The audience has the power to think about it. But it means active, literate audience who takes care and something like that. So, and I want to expand what Tanja said about the notions. It's not only about democracy, it's about also alternative. It's not only about counterpublic sphere, it's about interactivity, it's about community. And that struck me a lot this week in one course. We were discussing strategies for Instagram accounts. And then one of the students said to me, "Yeah, I want to build a community from the bottom up." And I asked her, "What is community for you?" "Oh, it's a good question. Never thought about that." So, yeah, how do you do a community on the, yeah, if you link each other and then put a heart on it. I said, It's not what when I started doing research, what I thought it's a community. And I think we have to develop notions of what means community and audience for us. Because if you don't think about it and precisely define it, the others will define it for us. We had a discussion in the seminar about what means the people. And there are specific notions here now in Germany to say it's not the people, it's the Volk, das Volk again. And it's not a very good notion. And so on. Yeah. This is one thing. And one another add. We talked about the global perspective. And we should also emphasize, because it's also now the question right now in Germany, if we talk about the migration policy, what does this mean for Europe? Not only for our Volk and for our nation, but what, not for the global perspective, what does this mean for Europe? And this is something Kurt Imhoff, sociologist, communication scientist from Switzerland, pointed out very rightly almost 10 years ago. He said, "We are very concerned with national media regulation. And we are very concerned with eyelid media on national level." We talked about Spiegel, Zeit, and so on. But how is it with eyelid media on the European level? It's hard to think that we have something like Süddeutsche Zeitung or the Guardian on a European level. Transnational media, which are supported by a diverse and transnational journalist collective or something like that, an audience. I like to watch Arte, but it's binational between Germany and France. And the share of the audience is only 1.5 or something like that. But other things are not out there. Democracy supporting, or not that many. And I'm just only talking about the media thing, and now only the discussion starts to think about a European platform, European social media or something like that. We should have talked about that 20 years ago. Now it's too late probably. But we could think about, I don't know, European space of virtual reality and something like that, augmented reality. So, yeah. Do I have more time? No, I think it's fine. Huh? That's one time. Okay, then just the third thing, because it's also one thing. It's about, we talked about empathy and about feelings. Now we're talking about notions. I were talking about European level in the place. It's about notion, and something that struck me also, and it's very important for research, and we turn in our discussion also to empirical research, is about the people are feeling it and experiencing it. It's not only objectively that's it. Now, some people are using the other terms. Because if you're doing field projects, and we ask the people, how do you perceive it, make sense of it? That's something also quite interesting. And for me, which was very striking, it's almost 10 or 15 years ago, in the Bundespressekonferenz in Berlin, Frauke Petri was asked. You know Frauke Petri, the former chairperson of the AfD, and she was asked by journalists and said, would you conceive yourself as extremist? And she already got tears and said, no. And it was really heartfully and truthfully. And she said, no, I'm the only Democrat left here. And all the others aren't. And that's, from an empirical point of view, and if you're doing qualitative research, very interesting how the people, it's not only, I was talking about instrumentalization and about, but some people are really feeling it. And that's something also what brings us in some conflicts, how to get along with that and say, from the symbolic intellectualism, and say, you want to understand, you not only want to explain it, how they feel, you want to understand it, and how you get along with that from a scientific point of view. And that also has some practical implications, how you can change that. Make sense of that. So, thank you very much for your attention. Now we get to the discussion round. And I prepared one question or two, depends on that, and then we open. It may be 3 or 4. And I will start with the first one, and we talked a lot about now about challenges and threats, and about how to make sense of that and to analyze that and what is important. So I would pose the next step. So what do we do in the next step? How we can get along with that, especially from the point of being at the university, being a researcher. What are the next steps?
You have to point to somebody. You're the chair.
So Nico, please.
Yeah, I knew that would backfire.
Immediately.
Yeah.
But I can trust you.
I think what to be done is, of course, a famous question that has had many good and wrong answers. Yes. And there's not one recipe. But I would argue, and you'll have to forgive me, but I'm very Gramscian in this perspective. So what Antonio Gramsci has been writing about is how to create alliances. The radical right has read Gramsci very, very well. They're applying every little idea of Gramsci. When it comes to cultural hegemony, it's Gramsci. And for the record, right, Gramsci was an Italian Marxist, so there's a bit of interesting contradiction there. But I actually agree with the strategy that Gramsci created, and that's creating alliances. And that also puts, I think, a responsibility of academics, of reaching out. And what I think we need, I said this before, is a coalition of the democratic willing. And I think academics can be part of that. But we should not control it, we should not create it, we should be part of it. And you know the famous coalition of the willing that was used in very different contexts, right? That was used to go to war in Iraq. So I would like to pervert that idea and make it into the coalition of the democratic willing. Because I think we need to have democratic forces join hands. Not to have a total agreement over the left and right wing axis, not to sort of win that struggle, and not to convince any right wing democratic nationalists, which is a legitimate discourse in a democratic context. I'm not, but that's not the point. We need to reach out, and in philosophical terms, it's sometimes called a chain of equivalence. We need to bring all these different ideas that are all democratic somehow together in one huge discursive material alliance. I think that's, when it comes to counter strategies, that's important. When it comes to academics, to be part of that, we are good organizers. It might not be very well known. It might not be very well known. But we actually do know how to organize, because we have to engage in so many things that involve organization. We have to use these skills to also bring people together in this democratic coalition of the democratic willing. That's one thing. The second thing, and I only have two. I will not do, Jeffrey, your thing. Do I have time for a third? Just two things. The second thing is, maybe also academics should become more than academics. We have been restricting ourselves to academia still too much. And the automatic reflex is, oh, there's a problem, let's write. Great. It's important to actually put ideas on paper. I will not oppose writing. Maybe we can do a bit more. Maybe we can help to organize. Maybe we can communicate differently. I've been working as an artist. So I use art as a tool of developing ideas and communicating them. I reach other audiences. Maybe not everybody. Art is not necessarily that sort of far-reaching. But it is about moving away from the exclusive fixed identity of the academic and to start thinking about other identities combined with the identity of the academic, not replacing them. And I use the AAA model for that, which is academic, artist, and activist. We can be all three. And that is, I think, a huge step for academics. And I think it's only a number of people that are willing to do that, can do that. But if we want to take some societal responsibility, we have to do what we do well as academics, but we have to do more.
May I add something on that?
Yes,
because
please.
we had a discussion on being an activist as a researcher, because it can damage you as a researcher to be called an activist, and we all know. And luckily, we are in a position of professors, so I always think I have to ensure myself I am free. I can do whatever I like, and I can choose my topics and work on it and talk about it because I'm safe. That's not true for a lot of people in the academia. But nevertheless, I think there is a need with regards to the current developments in political political debate. But I was thinking, can we maybe find another term, or we can stick with it, but to reframe this, because I was thinking about the debates with the journalists, and we talked about the repoliticization of journalism. What does it mean? Not to call yourself neutral or objective, but to fight for the democratic values of the Constitution, because this is what it means, not to be neutral. And if you look at the conventions for teachers, for instance, they are asked to be neutral. But what does it mean? If you look in Germany, we have a Beutelsbacher consensus. I don't know if you are familiar with it. You don't have to overwhelm. You are not allowed to overwhelm your students. You are not allowed to portray something as there's one solution. You have to show there are controversies if something is controversial. But you also have to defend the democratic values of the Constitution. This is what means to be neutral in regards to teachers. And if we can say neutrality with regards to journalism or research doesn't mean that we have to always emphasize that we are objective or neutral, but we have to take a stance. And that's something I find in a paper I read written by Silke van Dijk on fake news. I really liked reading it because she makes very clear that truth and lies, that's no reference point for politicians like Trump, for instance, and many more. That's not the reference point. And we have to understand this. And we also have to understand that they are using our theories of constructivism and deconstruction and make use of these theories. And then she argues, well, the reason for that is that we missed too much to take a normative stand and to make it very clear that also we can deconstruct things. We have to make clear that we do take a normative standpoint. And we have to show that this is for democratic values, for human rights, that it's criticizing racism, sexism, patriarchy, and so on and so on. We have to make clear that there is no neutrality. Maybe this could be a starting point. And regards to, and I went to the US during election time. It was a really depressive experience, I can tell you. But I listened to a talk about free speech, and the author argues for fearless speech. And there is a reference to Foucault and Parrhesia, so we can elaborate the theory behind this idea. But to make it very clear, when she talks about fearless speech instead of free speech, because free speech shouldn't be used to be free to tell every shit that you can think of. It means fearless speech if you offer for the marginalized people the opportunity to speak without fear. And if you can guarantee that people, marginalized, subaltern, poor people, can speak up, raise their voice without fear to be attacked or even arrested, then we can work for democracy. So, and I think that's very convincing. And I think we all also, I have no term yet, how to call myself, in public at least, at an activist, academic or researcher. I think we have to intervene in discourses, and maybe we can think about, that's our expertise, to think about notions and terms. Can we work with such a difference between free speech, fearless speech, to have some tools we can bring into the public discourse, to work with, to convince people, to not to talk about Foucault and Parrhesia. We can talk it in the classroom. It's important. It's really important. But we have to speak up in public, and we have to think about how can we profit from our knowledge, our expertise on theories, and convince people. Because if we, I stop soon. If I think about the petitions that are written now by academics, I can read it on pads. We are thinking about how to intervene in the public discourse right now from researcher sites. And we think about how can we defend gender studies, for instance. I'm in feminist theories and gender studies. I don't think that we can argue with our theories. We have to convince the people. And I don't want to have a debate on gender studies. We have to have a debate on critical research and studies and so on, because I think it's useless to think about. Yeah, but we have to find arguments and show up in public with convincing notions and ideas. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, also two things come to my mind with this question, and I think the first one is very much linked to what you already said. This is about the alliances and to make knowledge, to transfer knowledge in a way that it can be used for the best democratic developments. So, for example, I mean, I talked about mediated images of global others before, and foreign news reporting. The same is true if we look at the representation of people with a migratory experience in the media, etc. So we do know a lot. So if we follow at least legacy media these days, we can, as academics in media and communication studies, I think we have all the knowledge in a way to explain what's going wrong. So there is too much attention given to right-wing populist agendas. There is this question of what do we need to communicate about each quote by right-wing actors, etc., etc. We know about misrepresentations in the media. So how can we better find a better way to to also exchange with those on the ground, exchange with journalistic systems, exchange with, that's what I think you mean, to build also a relationship between these societal systems, so that they can better benefit from these also academic experience. So probably it's a part of the story is maybe the academic failure of communicating knowledge. Of course, we can do better always to transport knowledge. However, it's also probably, I wouldn't only talk about academics' failures here. It's also, about politicians and media to listen to what experts have to say, to better listen, to have a dialogue, between academia and society. I don't have an answer of how to do that, but that's a kind of observation that I have, and that links very much to what you've said. And there is another point, the second point, and this is probably much more linked to what I said earlier about this question of which kind of knowledge we produce and which kind of substance we are talking about, also phenomena we are talking about. And well, with my background in global communication, of course, I would also strengthen this very idea to internationalize academia at this point. I mean, we have a discussion right now in the German Media and Communication Association about how to cosmopolitanize knowledge production. So are we really interested as academics in, so to say, the right things? Are we? I mean, we often focus on media-centric communication phenomena, so that's probably one thing. Is it okay to always analyze social media, hate speech, etc., or shouldn't we also look at maybe the non-mediated realm of public discourses? What does happen in everyday life words? How can we give a voice as academics to those not heard, to those not having all these attentions online, for example? So this is maybe something, and also what I earlier said, do we have enough knowledge about what's going on elsewhere? How can we probably better benefit from international comparisons? How do people defend democracy elsewhere? What are strategies? Can we learn from South Korea, Hong Kong, whatsoever? So isn't there also a linkage, and isn't there a benefit to look beyond European borders to further internationalize our interest in often globally intertwined phenomena? So this would be a second maybe thought to also reconsider our own interests, our own routines in knowledge production, our own global knowledge of European academia, in a way to strengthen this, strengthen a more cosmopolitan and democratic, plural knowledge production.
Thank you very much for all of you. So now I think it's a great time to open it up. So the microphone is here in the second row. Questions, comments, please.
So thank you very much.
Take the microphone, please.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing those great ideas with us. I have a question referring to the idea of absolute free speech versus limits of free speech, because we have a current discussion here in Germany about the term remigration, and so some newspapers reported about it and said this wouldn't be possible some years ago to use this term as it is used today. And I wondered about the role of media in this process, that it is possible now, but wasn't possible 4 years ago. Thank you.
That's a good question.
I have no answer to this. I mean, we discussed it a little bit with the panelists of this podium I just mentioned, and the journalist from the Spiegel. She also mentioned it, that re-migration wouldn't be possible to use some years ago, and deportation. Some journalists use the term, but it's almost gone. I cannot see it in the news during the last weeks. But obviously, it's about deportation. The idea is deportation. And I'm not sure what's the dynamic behind this, that you can see it in the news, the remigration term all the time. Although there is some awareness that's it's a notion, it's a term that shouldn't be used, but still it's there. I don't know why.
I wasn't going to answer the question why.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a tricky, but I think you can look at it as an oil spill. So at some point people drop ideas and they use particular concepts and they spread. Now they can spread in a million different ways. Media are one way that they get distributed in a variety of medias, because you can say, okay, mainstream media are starting to use it. Yeah, that's one way it spreads, but it also spreads even through interpersonal communication. In the case of the Belgian radical right, which I tend to know a bit as a Belgian, you see these terms being published in books from the radical right, and you see that they go through lectures. Then there's media attention for the lectures, then the term is used, so it gets more and more visibility. So that's the oil spill idea. I mean, and that's a strategy. You drop concepts, and sometimes they work, and they get replicated and repeated, and then you get eventually a process of normalization and acceptance, or you get a process of rejection. You can say, this is not, we cannot say this. But in some cases, and this is where, of course, the entire cultural context matters, some concepts become more acceptable at a particular time. They were not years before, but the entire concept, the entire context, political, cultural context has made these concepts more acceptable. And so more and more people start using it. That's how a concept actually spreads. It's like an oil spill. Yeah. And I think that's the dynamics. And just one sentence, media organizations can decide not to be part of that. But then you get the argument, yeah, but the others are using it, which is where the oil spill actually starts really working. And I think that is a problematic argument. I think that a media organization has a responsibility to reflect about the language it uses. And it should not necessarily be copying other media. If other media decide to do so, fine. But I think that also the newsroom, so to speak, has a responsibility of its own to decide to use it or not. Because the oil spill metaphor works. You need to, when it comes to these very problematic concepts, you need to contain them. You need to block them from being used, and you also need to deconstruct them. You need to say, well, in Dutch, the ontvolking, right, is the, and you understand the word, right? it's used and you see it circulate, but it's also resisted. And that's, again, a struggle whether that concept will be accepted or not. And I think there are good strategies to try to counter that, to contain it, to start saying, look, this is really a term that has a history and you can't just use it without referring to that history and getting yourself in a very problematic spot. And that's the rejection and resistance strategy which we need to keep using.
Yeah, I think it also leads us to debate maybe journalism ethics these days in terms of democratic, you mentioned the neutrality idea, so I don't have empirical evidence or enough empirical evidence, but I would argue that the legislative class, mass media is co-responsible for this trend to normalize all these terminologies, and as you know, always referring to the agenda set by these empowered right-wing populist actors, of course, is part of the struggle to fixate meaning here. And sometimes I feel it helps to look at what is not discussed in these discourses. So why don't we use these terminologies and transfer them in the public to a debate about human rights, to a debate about totally different discourse chains we can think about. So why do we use these harsh terminologies and not discuss other forms of support, healthcare, whatsoever? And here I think we see, or that might be for us a very interesting analysis, not only to look at what is communicated all the time, but also to reflect upon the alternatives, the dialectics that are not used here, or the unsaid criticisms, etc., etc. So this is just a reflection, and then we are, of course, talking about journalism ethics. So how should I talk about these topics?
I want to add one, and it draws on what Nico said. It's a very nice metaphor to say it's oil, because oil is dialectical. We need oil for our engines. So the news needs these notions to produce media. But if it's not refined, then it breaks the environment. And that's the problem also. It's what Rosa is saying from sociological point of view, the German sociologists. We live in times of acceleration. Now so much is produced that journalism acts hastily. It's something we talked about several days ago. So Trump produces, and his team, it's not only him, it's his whole team, produces bullshit every day 10,000 times. And what is journalism doing? And we are doing, we're only reacting to it. So it's garbage which blocks our systems. Yeah? And that's something. And we are not, and because we are only reacting, we are not producing ourselves new terms or other things. So we are very in a defensive role. And this is something. And it accelerates. That's also what Rosa is saying. It's one notion which was, I'm very sensitive to that, and always talk with my students to them and say, think about it. Use the term fake news. It's the same thing. And now we are using it, not only journalists, using the scientists themselves, and we should always put that it's fake news. But misinformation, disinformation, blah, 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 propaganda is much better wording probably. And now the notions are popping up, and we are not able to reflect it, proceed it, and then probably also new technology comes in. Probably AI would help us to deconstruct it and produce other things, or not. I don't know. But the complexity is much more. And this is one thing. And I don't talk about the other thing because we are in the discussion and then probably more.
I've one question regarding the regulatory measures on social media that you mentioned in your book, because shortly after Trump was elected, Mark Zuckerberg had this statement where he said he will reduce the regulatory measures. And I remember thinking when I heard that statement, he's just using that as an excuse to avoid the wrath and the revenge of Trump. But my question would be, what's your opinion on this regulatory measures on social media? Has it actually gone too far in the last years, as he mentions? Is there a truth or some truth behind it? Or was it, like my first impression, just an excuse to get along with the new leaders, the political leaders?
There are a couple of things. One is the bigger picture, because you need to distinguish between what is called regulation and self-regulation, right? So what we often see is that most democratic states are very careful to over-regulate, and they push towards media self-regulation. The idea is not to enforce, but to at least have media organizations regulate themselves. And we've actually seen a lot of self-regulation. Now, the problem with self-regulation is that it might fail, that it might not go far enough. And that's where you need government or state regulation to counter and deal with the gaps that self-regulation leaves. That's the bigger picture. I think, for instance, the European Union has realized that self-regulation is not working and has become, with the different recent acts, has become much stronger in intervening. And that's the regulatory dimension that I was talking about. Now, to go to your question, I think that if you look at what Facebook has been doing, is that still a lot of deeply problematic statements managed to go through. I think that's the analysis. So the argument that, well, we pushed it too far, I see little evidence. I think actually, especially, I mean, you can have a discussion about moderation in the English language, but especially the other languages, there was a complete problematic situation when you looked what started to circulate. So whatever interventions, whatever models Facebook used, they were insufficient. And now to use the argument we overdid it is cynical. So, and I think there's a bigger story there, and forgive me for that. We need to understand that communication can be instrumentalist, that it can be strategic, that people make statements to hide things, to cloak, to actually cover up business strategies or political strategies. So what somebody says, great, it's a statement. And I think we need to scrutinize it and see what motivations are, what's behind that. And there's an old concept from political communication that we stopped using for some strange reason, which is spinning. The idea that you spin a message to fit into your own interest, which has been used as a propaganda strategy. We see the same spinning happening all along these debates. And we don't label it spinning anymore, which I find fascinating, because this is pure spinning. This is coming up with a set of arguments that make no sense whatsoever, because they're totally at odds with the interest of the person speaking. And that we need to analyze. That's what we need to say. Houston, we have a problem here.
Yeah, may I add to this, because from a feminist standpoint, Zuckerberg's comment on...
Sorry, yeah.
Yes. On femininity, too much femininity in companies, and the reinforcement of masculinities. I mean, this is the framework I touched upon when I said the idea of cries, to call a defensive publics, to show and to give some emphasis that this is a reinforcement of power hierarchies that refer to white supremacies and patriarchy and so on and so on. And that's, I mean, that's crazy. And I always, in the mornings, I think I'm not speechless anymore. But again and again, this happened. And if I look at the decision-making processes today, this hour, I guess it's going on right now. They have another voting with regards to restrictive asylum and migration policies. And I'm shocked again and again. But nevertheless, we have to become louder, to create alliances and to show solidarity to the ones who are not in this kind of privileged positions we are as academics and researchers. Yeah.
I have another question, if it's okay.
Sure.
So I was also thinking about polarization and the role of the media, because so I was at a conference last week and it was about stereotypes and discrimination and stuff like that, and all the presenters talked a lot about us and the others and about in-groups and out-groups. And so I wondered if our discussions about us and the others and its presentation in the media, if they deepen polarization, or if we can do something, and if yes, what, against that polarization tendencies for collective responsibilities in a more integrative sense.
I just talked.
Okay. There's a footnote about polarization, because it's a very tricky concept. And I think it's not about differences of opinion, because often that gets conflated. It's about making the person that you disagree with your enemy. Right? There's a component of antagonism in there. And I think that probably antagonization is a better concept than polarization, but that's a footnote. But it's important to keep in mind, like, okay, it's about labeling, defining the others as enemy. And that, of course, connects with othering, stereotyping. Right? That's because it's basically it's okay to say we're different. But when the other becomes the enemy, then we're in trouble. Then we're ethically on very, very problematic areas. And that is at the European level, but also at the global level. We're really good at labeling others as enemy other. At some point, Zizek was writing about the other neighbor. We can also define the other as our neighbor. The other friend, we can define the other as a friend, as a companion. Or we can define them as the self, as part of us. At the cosmopolitan level, at the level of the world, or at the level of a particular nation, national community, whatever. So how we define these others really matters. It's not saying you're different, that's not the issue. It's you're a problem. And that brings in stereotyping, the reductionism of the stereotype, reducing people and groups to negative characteristics. Right? That's the definition of stereotyping. And there, again, media allows to circulate these kinds of othering processes. We're good at it. We have to admit, it's a very tentative, seductive discourse to see the other as a threat, because the other is always different, and difference is not easy to handle. And so I think that the rethinking of what the other is, and in Belgium, I used to live in a district that was mixed Belgian-Moroccan, and then a Jewish component. So it was very hybrid. And of course, people like me enjoyed that, because that diversity is exactly what is provoking. It's not always easy to deal with difference, but it's incredibly charming at the same time, because the challenge makes you a better human. And we've lost that idea. And that's where the problem is. If you simply say, like, we're polarized, it doesn't mean much. The problem is we're defining others as enemy others, and we're forgetting that reaching out to them is actually enriching. That's where I think the problem lies.
Yeah, I totally agree. So it's culture of acknowledgement of difference. We seem to forget a little. That's why I also said, why don't we talk about human rights and more dialogue, for example? Yeah, so this dialogic approach, I very much like what the South African colleague Herman Wasserman called the ethics of listening. So we this idea to take everyone, you know, as the acknowledged other whom we talk to. So to establish dialogic, reciprocal relationships, and I think media can help to strengthen these perspectives. I mean, you mentioned it, all this stereotyping, talking about the other. However, we can also ask, okay, how much do we really talk with one another in the media? Who's talking to one another? Who's listening? So it's not just maybe about always strengthening the right to communicate, but also this multicultural right to be heard, right to be understood, right to dialogically interact with one another. So interaction as a principle of cohesion, and therefore. I think it's probably much more linked to forms or debates about media ethics, of how to present societal discourse also in the media. So do we learn that if we follow in the public that everyone is talking about one another, or where are the encounters where we really engage on a dialogic level? So this comes to my mind, although I don't have the perfect strategy at hand to go back to this form of, I mean, in theory it's called differently, tolerance, acknowledgement, forms of, welcoming diversity, difference in a way. In a more inclusive way, as you mentioned, rather than always talking about exclusions, constructing these ideas of in and out groups. You mentioned it, but say, okay, why don't we talk about this plurality and unity in diversity? So to speak.
One of the concepts that's been used in conflict theory is the idea of the contact zone. And I think that is precious in thinking through how to develop these kind of strategies. And of course, for instance, it's a classic example. We have an Erasmus program. It's about bringing people into different parts of Europe. Okay, we started to globalize the Erasmus program so that we can also have people travel to other parts of the world, which is brilliant. But the creation of contact zones is vital. Mm-hmm. And it's about seeing that the other is not that strange, that the other is different, but the other is a human being with emotions, with problems, with expectations, rights, with all sorts of weird ideas that are just as weird as mine. And seeing that, experiencing that, is what the contact zone offers. And I think that is a key instrument. It's used for conflict transformation, right? So it's used to go for more transitional situations post-war. But it's a precious one. And we can use it in many different contexts to stimulate these kinds of dialogues.
Yeah, and I think the academia has to be in touch much more with civil society and the society in the cities. I mean, at least I don't know if it will be a success story, but at my universities we think about, I mean, the city is the university if you go to Tübingen, that's easy. But to get in touch more with the people, because the students, to bring together students, that's one idea. But to realize we are in a post-migrant societies. We don't have to have the Erasmus students. We have people from different backgrounds in the streets. You can go out, you cannot avoid, and it's a good reality that you cannot avoid. But to find spaces where people can really encounter, that's the problem, I guess. And where they can experience that it's, I do love the term being in common instead of belonging. Being in common, to have common interests, to find there are different challenges in the city we can work on together, and to experience a being in common, which is so much worse for the idea who belongs to the society. So I guess it's, yeah, I mean, we have to start in every place we are working to find these spaces where we can really try to practice being in common. And to see that I don't have to have the same experiences like the other person. We have to share maybe the same analysis for the power structures that position people on different social positions in the society. If we can share the analysis for the reasons for that and the hierarchies, then maybe we can be in solidarity and we can practice solidarity. It's not about attitudes, it's about practice, I guess.
Yeah, may I add something, because it's this idea that, I mean, you also ask about the responsibility of the media to some extent here. Of course, it's stimulating dialogue, but maybe also to really disclose all those experiences, yeah, to maybe find interesting experts in our society about a lot of experiences. So we do have, I mean, a lot of people with a migratory experience in their own biography. They are not just migrant others. They are experts, you know. They have huge knowledge we can probably benefit from. So, and that's why I said, let's look at alternative narratives we can provide in order to counter hegemonic discourses. So maybe we need to tell different stories and need to disclose different lived realities, so to get in touch with diverse lived realities in our society. And, yeah.
Another question going in a different direction. When we are looking at the platforms, the new tech era we are in, the fifth estate, like it was called in the debate, I don't know who said it, but it was an interesting concept. And when we are looking how to act in this realm and how to act against the disinformation campaigns that are happening there seem to be two main actions that states are putting into. The one would be as resilience and education, and the other is regulation. And regulation is very easy because it doesn't cost anything. You can just say, okay, we're now putting some laws into action, and then something has to happen and they have to regulate now. The other thing is resilience, and that is very expensive, and therefore nothing has happened whatsoever. So everybody's saying, yeah, we need to educate ourselves better, and that's kind of the dilemma we're in. And I would say there is a third option, and that would be to dismantle these platforms and to go back to another state and look at how we can change the public sphere, like we have it now, as an kind of a property of Musk, of Zuckerberg, of all those people. And that's a big problem because, like I said, Musk was talked about here, it is a problem that he has this power. So why don't we are not strong enough to come to this third solution in this way? What has to happen to change it back, or to go even further to a more network internet anymore, or network internet where we are connected together and not by algorithms decided by a couple of people who are not under democracy, or not legitimized democratically. Thank you.
Jeffrey, do you want to start?
Yeah, take this. Yeah.
No, you're referring to the idea of, for example, Dutton tells it the fifth estate, and and I talked about it in one of my statements that we are probably too late for that, 20 years, so it should be done. And because if we do it like dismantle, then the right wing would say, oh, this is more than censorship, and they bred something. I think it's also not an answer, but it's probably one perspective to bring in the audience perspective. Not to think about dismantling means something very hard one. It's we should think about stop using it or using it in another way and use other things. So we, in our institute, we had some research seminar about the idea of the Fediverse and kind of alternative things, using Mastodon instead of X or using Pixabay just in that. And this was something, it's also part of resilience to literate the people and say, okay, there are other things than the so-called social media, and that would empower you, help you, make you money. But it's not only to tell it. So, and then what some of my colleagues were saying, okay, putting some contact zones that the students can use it and produce it, and also the students act as mediators. Because if the students are using it, then probably the parents are, the relatives are, the friends are, and then step by step. And that's also kind of bottom-up approach. And it's kind of a networks we can produce. So that could be one small solution to it.
I think in the academic world, at least, but also in other areas, there's been always a strong argumentation in favor of what is called MIL, right? Media and Information Literacy. And we've been defending that for decades. So I'm not going to change my mind. I mean, this is incredibly relevant. How to organize that is another thing. Because then the question is, yeah, but what is actually being taught? Right? What do you include in these programs? How do you organize it, but also what content? And that's not that clear. And there's, I think, there was a lot of emphasis in MIL on reception, how to interpret, and not that much on production. How do you communicate yourself in an ethical way? And I think MIL needs to be both, and we've put too much emphasis on reception. For instance, that's the content discussion. The other point you raise is much more tricky, obviously, because there, and we used it in the book, there's the paradox of tolerance. How far, in other words, how much intolerance do you tolerate? And if you start countering intolerance, when do you become intolerant? And if you don't intervene, what then happens with your tolerance? If the intolerant destroy your tolerance, that's the kind of paradox that Popper was talking about. And this is actually one of the biggest dilemmas. When I was referring to, okay, when is it a political struggle and when is it a threat? It's actually the same translation of that paradox. When do you argue that this is acceptable within democracy? This is not. So platforms, when do you say it's legitimately there and we should deal with it, regulate it, but deal with it and accept it? Or it's no longer acceptable and we should ban it? That's a very tricky debate for reasons that Jeffrey argued. But I would again, and to build on what Jeffrey was saying, I think that we need to look at media diversity. I think what we have seen is a concentration of power in a few platforms with little alternatives. We have not seen any public service online platforms that are worthy of that name. Right? Public social media, we don't have them. There are attempts from grassroots, the Fediverse, to create them. But we as European societies, we've been quite inactive in creating alternatives that are attractive, pleasant, and fun. Because that's another point we should not forget. Social media are fun. They give pleasure. And there's nothing wrong with pleasure, right? It's good in a society to create systems of pleasure. If the pleasure becomes instrumentalized against democracy, there is a problem. But pleasure is important, and we should not forget the need that social media are serving, that is to provide pleasure, media pleasure. And so, but if we can find alternatives that still provide that pleasure and that are, say, democratically acceptable, then I would argue for them to be built and to be developed, to be rolled out. Now that's easier said than done. Because when you talk about expenses, we're talking about real expenses. But we do have public service broadcasters, public service media, as they're now called. They can play that role. And you see, for instance, Netflix is getting competition from at least there are alternatives to Netflix. Like, I'm a big fan of the Greek Erfurt, because it really offers great material. So there are, in the public service media realm, there are alternatives being developed. And they need to be much more developed. Because let's not look at this stage at banning, because it is a very tricky and harsh solution. Let's look at alternatives, and let's look at the creation of diversity. If everything else fails, I'm not opposed to banning. If it becomes utterly problematic, if it becomes a threat to democracy, it's legitimate to reduce that threat. And just as a reminder, European Union was not too careful in banning Russian television channels very quickly. That was debatable, but clearly that decision was taken. So in some cases, there is an argument to be made for a more radical solution. But I think that you have a whole range of options, and building and rolling out diversity would be, at this point in time, still my preferred solution.
Would prefer this too, but I think
Microphone.
I would prefer this too, but I would say the time is ticking, and we're seeing right now, and that's really the point of looking at these platforms as kind of property, and also as a thing that is making capital and money and giving those people more and more power. I'm a bit scared of Musk, but I'm also a bit much more scared of Mark Zuckerberg, because the platforms he has now is also very powerful. And to looking at him sitting next to Narendra Modi in India and discussing how to discriminate better against Muslims is also very scary. And that's the power there is. And that's, so I don't know, it would be better if we are strong enough to compete and building alternatives. But I don't see that we are on a good foot or good standing in the situation, and we are 20, 30 years too late, maybe. And that's the point I'm making. We kind of have to be realistic in this moment. And I don't see that we, when we could build up resilience, it would also be possible. But where do we get the money from? It's really the question.
Maybe just quickly to defend the EU, because once in a while it's good to do that as well, right? I think that European Parliament did wake up. And we can critique them for being late, yes. But you now see the major shift, and I don't think we really appreciate how huge that shift is, where the idea that media have to be regulated at the EU level, and no longer at the national level exclusively, that's a hell of a change. And that was a really, really big reversal in EU policy, and I think a very correct one. And that has opened the door for more initiatives when it comes to creating more media diversity and better regulation, but also financing at the European level a number of projects and supporting public service, for instance. So there are a few opportunities we now have that maybe 10 years ago we didn't have because this shift hadn't been made yet. Your point that we're running out of time, I would half agree, because I don't like the stress of constantly having to respond to American companies. I mean, it's not up to them to decide how we handle our democracies. And we have been staring at the US with fascination and with horror. Maybe we should also be a bit more distant. And I mean, I feel deeply sorry for the American people. They're in a bad situation. And in particular, some of the groups are in a deeply problematic situation. I have the fullest empathy for them. But we should not constantly refer to a radical right-wing regime in the US as our reference point. And I now use it as a complex, not a regime in itself, that also a complex that links up with large media companies, that is becoming this assemblage of political and media power, and military power, by the way. We should not be blinded by that. It is not our constant reference point, because if we do that, if we only look at the USA, right, and America is, even if all of a sudden the Gulf of Mexico is no longer the Gulf of Mexico, right? America is not the same as the USA, but we should be aware of these complexities. There are other countries in the world where we can connect to, where we can get really good examples, and maybe we should stop like being blinded. And literally, we're like rabbits staring at the light bulb of the US, and it's not helping. And I think it's important to understand what is happening in the US. It's important to look at the world. So that's where I think that the time metaphor is also a bit dangerous, because yes, there are problems, we need to address them substantially, but let's not be blinded by things that are going horribly wrong in one particular country.
It was very pleasant, it was fun, informative, and time flies so much. So we are more than 50 minutes late. So I'm sorry to end the session. So the contact zone was great. And feel free to discuss and approach with us or get in contact after the official ended. So, but as you know, you have other dates and you have to hurry at the university, so I have to end it. But not without saying big thank you to our three guests today, to Anne, Nico, and Tanja.
Let me say thank you for the book and the contribution and the debate, which will be inspired by the book. I think it will be valuable very soon, so let's advertise this book.
How could I disagree?
And thank you very much for being here. That was very nice. Thank you.